my goal at this point, whether that's within a 12-step fellowship or just on a regular day-to-day basis, is to be as open and honest about my recovery as I can. Because if people aren't out here breaking the stigma and offering themselves as an example of recovery, then you're not going to know that they're a person in recovery. I can walk around and do and say the right things all I want, but I'm not an example of recovery if you don't know I'm in recovery. So there's a lot of stigma around addiction, and if you're drinking and using drugs, it must be because you're a bad person and it's a moral failing and you need to just stop. You need to just say no. It hasn't worked. Things have gotten much worse. So we have to, I feel that we have to shift the paradigm and say, okay, just telling people to not do it isn't working. So what can we do? What supports can we offer? How can we shift the way that we look at this to help people get better instead of just wagging our finger and feeling good about it because we wagged our finger? It doesn't do anything for us. So that's why I feel like I have to do what I do. And there's a lot of work to be done. There still is a lot of stigma around addiction, but it is changing. And every time we have a conversation, you might change one person's mind. John, and I am a person in long-term recovery, and for me that means I have been sober since August 7th, 2012, which means I had 7 years last Wednesday, a week and a half ago. And the person that I am like right now standing in front of you is nothing like who I was when I got here 7 years ago. And things are going very well now, but that wouldn't be the case if I hadn't had the support that I've had through 12-step programs, my family, social supports. I have a lot of people around me who have helped me to get to where I am today, and I don't think that I could have done it without them. So I'll kind of take you back, walk you through how I got there to struggling, and then how I got better. And kind of talk about some of the larger things that affect addiction, how they impacted my story, and how they affect us overall as a society. At least how I see the plan. I'm not an expert. So I was raised in a fairly well-off, blue-collar, middle-class-ish family in Chichester, Pennsylvania. No one's ever to blame for someone developing addictive tendencies or what drives people into addiction, because I believe all parents are really trying their best and everybody's doing the best with what they can. We're all only equipped with the tools that we have, and I think that was the case for my parents. And so somewhere, I was fairly normal, quote unquote, for like 3 or 4 years of my life, and then not so much. Some of my earlier memories are kind of tied to what I would now call like a mental illness and what developed into depression, but and I apologize for like some of the dark nature of some of the things I'll say. I'll keep the language a bit coded, but one of my first memories was going to, I came to the landing in my parents' house. I remember that so vividly. I was like 4 or 5, and I came down the stairs and I told them, that I had a plan for myself. We lived near train tracks, and that's what I was going to do. Because whatever was happening for 4 or 5-year-old John at the time was so great that that's what I wanted to do. And sure, I didn't have the understanding of what that actually meant, other than that, my guess is that I didn't want to exist. And I didn't want to be feeling things anymore because what I was feeling was unpleasant. And sometime in middle school, with a fairly, nothing crazy happened between then and middle school, but then once I got into middle school, I remember things getting really, really hard. And that's when I started doing things like cutting. And I don't know how familiar you are all with cutting. I think that's self-harm. And for me, that was a coping skill that I found. And it gave me a relief that I was seeking. You could look at it from a physiological perspective of releasing pain and releasing endorphins and stuff like that. But for me, it was just a way to feel a little bit different for a second, to feel outside of myself. to feel different than I felt the moment before. And my parents didn't know what to do with that. Cutting has like become more commonplace over the last, I don't have numbers on that, last 20 or 30 years. And so my parents didn't know what was going on, and they'd try to lie about it and say, I reached into it. I always said that I had reached into a bush to get a football, was what I would say, and I didn't play sports. And they knew that I didn't like playing sports. So I think it was just like, they pretended to believe me because it was uncomfortable. And none of that cutting was the kind where I needed to be hospitalized. I wasn't trying to kill myself, but I was seeking relief. And I guess, so all this time I'm in Chichester High School, which is public school in the area, and my grades start going a little further down. I had done really well up until around 8th grade, and my parents said, like, get it together or we're gonna send you to private school. And I didn't believe them, so they sent me to private school. And so I went from I was accustomed to a certain kind of lifestyle and being around a certain kind of people, and then they sent me to this, because they had started doing better and better, they sent me to this like fairly expensive private school in Delaware. I just didn't feel like I fit in. I don't know if it's true, like whether I actually didn't fit in or if it was just like my mental illness telling me I wasn't good enough, but either way I did not feel okay. And the cutting really took off, and this is around the time that I found alcohol and drugs. So the first memory I have, or lack of a memory really, I remember up until a certain point this night, and I was at a party for that high school. I was 15 maybe, and we went to this person's house I didn't know, and I drank a bunch and was like, fairly drunk, and then a bunch of guys were like, here, try this, it's called Everclear, which is grain alcohol. And I remember having a couple shots of that, and then I don't remember anything else besides waking up in someone else's house the next day. Didn't have any of my things, and they had to drive me home to my parents because I was still so intoxicated. They drove my car back to like where I lived, and then I drove down the street so I could act like I had driven home. And that would sort of exemplify my drinking for the rest of my life. I always blacked out. I had no ability to not black out. Once I started drinking, I drank until I could not drink anymore. And that's just because of what alcohol did for me. I was seeking escape, and for me, blacking out was the ultimate escape. I didn't record memories, I didn't feel like I existed. And I kind of just did that for a while. And it worked for a while. I didn't feel as depressed when I was drunk. I didn't feel all this pain, like that voice that had always told me I'm not good enough was quiet, just for a little bit. And that was what I had been seeking. That's what I saw when I was cutting, and that's what I was finding in alcohol now. I also started throwing in some drugs in at this point. Marijuana was something that I did almost every day for a long time. But other drugs, cocaine, and really whatever anybody handed me once I was drinking. Like, I didn't go out of my way to seek drugs usually, but once I had drank alcohol, it didn't matter. If you gave me something that might make me feel different, I was going to take it. So there's a number of times I took things and I don't know what they were. And that was just how my addiction and my alcoholism affected me. In college, my mental health kept getting worse, unfortunately, and the cuts became more extreme, and the people around me at this point, my friends in college, are doing everything they can to like keep me alive, because now I'm threatening suicide and contemplating it. And I have, at this point, my scars are mostly healed, but I really started hurting myself in a way that was scaring people around me, and I was torturing them. Every night that we went out, which was for me almost every night of the week, they had to, by the end of the night, babysit me, and I'm lucky that they did. I don't know why they did. I guess they saw me as valuable or something. But they did, and they took care of me. And I graduated college. I got a job as a TSS. I was working with kids with developmental disorders in Broomall, Pennsylvania. And my drinking went from a few nights a week to every night. So at this point, I'm waking up hungover every day. I didn't start drinking on the job, fortunately, since I was working with kids. Could have been much worse. But I pretty much smelled like alcohol all the time. Every time I walked into an elementary school, I was throwing up in toilets that were this big, and Elmo was on the wall behind me, and I was just like throwing up every day. And the teachers at the schools where I worked knew I had a problem, and they would talk to me, but they never like called my bosses. There's a bunch of things that didn't happen that I could have gotten me in a lot more trouble, and they didn't happen, and I'm grateful for that. But eventually, eventually I would get 302, which in Pennsylvania that's an involuntary psychiatric commitment, because that's what I needed. Bear in mind that my uncle, my father's brother, had passed away from a heroin overdose when I was 17, and when that happened, I remember saying to them and to myself, like, not me. No, I'm not going to have those problems. What's funny is I never used heroin, and I told myself that because I wasn't using those drugs, that I didn't have a problem. Alcohol, everyone drinks, right? So like, how could I have a problem? It's on TV. We do it like at social gatherings. Alcohol is fine, but it's just a different kind of a drug. It's a chemical that changes the way that my brain works. It just happens to be legal. So I told myself for a long time that it was fine. And for some people it is. For me it's not. When I was eventually at 302, I had written a suicide note and I was ready to go. And I had a brief moment where I was like, maybe it doesn't have to be this way. Like, there's got to be a better way. And I called my friend and he drove me to the hospital. I was not 302. Drove me to the hospital, and then I waited in the crisis department for 7 hours. I sobered up, and by the time I saw the psychiatrist, I was like, look, I was having a rough morning. I'd like to go home now. He's like, all right, see you. He sent me home. And I got to my parents' house, and I said, good to see you. It's been quite a day. I'm going to go out now and drink with my friends. And that's when they called the police. And the police came, they found I went in my room, they took my suicide note. That was their justification for a 302, and they took me back to that same exact psych ward where I had been released an hour and a half before. I don't know if I saw the same psychiatrist, I don't remember. I'm sure he didn't feel great about it. And while I was there, I got exposed to Alcoholics Anonymous. There's part of AA where they bring meetings into institutions and hospitals and prisons, and they brought a meeting into the psych ward where I was being held. And I was like, wow, you guys, it's Saturday, and you guys are in a psych facility talking about your drinking problem. Like, I don't want your life. No thank you, take care. I'll see you around. And I didn't stop drinking. I couldn't put together the fact that the reason I was in the psych facility was because I was drinking all of the time. And I started seeing a psychiatrist as a condition of my release from the 302. And every week I would see him, and he sort of slowly planted the idea, like, hey, maybe if you didn't consume a depressant every day, you might be less depressed. Over time, it wore on me, and I happened to go in on a day where I was feeling especially willing. And he was ready to hear me. He was waiting for this day, obviously. And so he gave me a phone number for a facility in Pennsylvania and said, you know, this is where you can go to treatment. I know some people there, it's a good place. Unfortunately, they didn't have a bed. And best practice in that scenario is to say, we'll find you a bed somewhere else. But they did not. They said, hold on, just hang tight. And then I hung tight for 5 days. And in the meantime, they had said, you can't stop drinking, like, that's dangerous for you. You can't just abruptly stop drinking alcohol if you're chemically dependent. It could be fatal. Please keep drinking until you get here. So then my family babysat me for, I really can't remember any of those days. I think it was 4 or 5 days. And that was torture for them. Probably the hardest time that they've had with me or any of their kids. And eventually I did get into the facility, and I got there and they were like, okay, you also can't smoke weed. I was like, no, I have a drinking problem. I have a drinking problem, I'm going to stop drinking alcohol, but I'm going to do these other things because you can't take away my only solutions. Like, I don't know how to be a person without something to depend on outside of myself. And they had to break that down for me and say, look, the reason that you're relying on these things is because you lack the ability to cope with life. And we need you to develop real coping skills that aren't chemicals. So that was something I learned when I got there, because that just didn't make sense to me. I have a drinking problem, not a marijuana problem. But they did a really good job of explaining that to me. And then once I got out, I did relapse briefly, but I had been exposed to AA in a different way at that point, and I went back to meetings, and someone made themselves my sponsor, which is not, it's not normally how it's done. I'm really grateful that this guy did, because I stuck around. He just kept coming up to me and being like, "You need me to sponsor you." He was like this guy from South Philly. He was like, "I used to live under a bridge and shoot dope in my neck." I was like, "Oh my gosh." I don't know. But he was relentless, and whatever he, like, for me it was like, okay, I don't really relate to you in many ways, but whatever, you were in a much theoretically worse position than I was, and you're doing a lot better now. So I'm willing to do whatever it is you're doing because your life is better than mine. And it stuck. And that was August 7th, 2012 that I called him. And since then, I haven't had a reason to pick up a drink. And that does not mean that my life has like just gotten tremendously better in every aspect. Like I still have to live life. And that was a myth that I had to smash too, right? I was like, okay, I do have a drinking problem. Cool, and I'll stop drinking, and then I won't have a problem. But that wasn't the case. I had a lot to learn, and I had a lot to unlearn. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I have been able to apply to my sobriety is that I don't know what I'm doing. And the people around me are like willing to help me in a way that like I wasn't willing to see before. I thought anybody who got in the way of my drinking was like really just trying to ruin my life. And that's just not how people were approaching me. But I couldn't see that when I was so focused on getting my solution from alcohol. And then being in a 12-step fellowship and having a community around me of people who are like have shared a common trauma and are working towards a common goal provided me with the support that gave me the foundation that I needed to stay away from alcohol one day at a time for 7 years. And the relationships that I have now, both with my family and with other people, have gotten tremendously better as well because I'm the fullest version of myself. I'm not dulled down by chemicals, and I don't need to change the way I feel in order to connect with somebody else. I'm connecting with them based off of who I am right now without alcohol and drugs. And that's beautiful to me. I didn't think I'd ever be able to have that. And I especially didn't think I'd be able to do it like one-on-one, like go to a party and not have a drink or two just to calm the nerves, right? Like I don't have to do that anymore. And that doesn't mean I don't like experience social anxiety. I have social anxiety right now. But I know how to deal with it. And I know that voice that's telling me I'm not good enough, or that these people hate you, that's just like part of like my depression that isn't telling the truth. And I don't have to listen to it. I know people who have passed away. My uncle, obviously, before I got sober, but one of my best friends from growing up. It'll be 2 years in the beginning of September from the pills that he was prescribed for surgery. And there's just so many things that could lead us to addiction. There need to be like equal or more resources to lead us away from addiction. Ultimately, I think we'll treat and we'll understand trauma and childhood trauma enough that we'll be creating fewer addictions in the first place. But right now, we have a crisis to deal with today, so we can treat those and also keep studying how to prevent people from needing to rely on an addiction in the first place. The science is new. There's a lot to learn. And I don't know nearly everything. I know nothing, like I said. But I know just enough to have the conversation. And what can we do as a community, as a society in general? I think, one, we're doing it. It's already happening. The first step towards that is having a conversation. You can't seek solutions. You can't bring things to the light if you're not willing to talk about them. So you're already a step ahead just by being here tonight. So kudos to you. The ability to go to your parent and say, this is what I'm feeling, without being afraid that they're going to be shamed, or they're going to be dismissed, they're going to be told to get over it. Just man up. I heard that one.
That's a good one, yeah.
Because we're going to feel our feelings, one way or the other. So either we're going to do it healthfully, or they're going to come out in some way that doesn't end up good for anybody. So just creating a safe environment to have a conversation, I think, is really, really important.